All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. And if we have folks join us midstream, that is just fine. For those of you who don't know me, which is probably most of you, my name is John Hershey. I am the Dean of the School of Humanities at Georgia Highlands College. And I have been invited to talk a little bit today about your big read selection, which is Madeline Miller's novel, Circe. I want to thank Heather Heath for making this possible, the Golden Isle Arts Organization, and of course the folks and my friends at Coastal College of Georgia, who have always been great. This is the first, and I hope only year, that we will have a conversation virtually, because it is so great to be there in person. So my presentation today is titled, Pardon Me, Myth, The Power of Women in World Mythology. And I'm gonna show the cover of the book there. Actually, two books are at the heart of this conversation. One is Madeline Miller's novel, based on the Greek myths. And then Edith Hamilton's book on mythology, which I have used in the classroom for decades. And I actually brought I don't know if you can't really see how worn this is and how brown the pages are, but this book has been well loved, and it's still helpful. I may have to spring for a new edition one of these days. But like most of my explorations in the big read discussions, the primary book, Circe, has led me to looking at all kinds of different things. So some of these seem totally off subject, and others I'm going to try and relate it all. I'm going to try and tie it all in together if I possibly can. But if any of you have had that experience, because I'm hoping that there are a few of you out there that still remember a dictionary when it was an actual book, and you look up a word, but then on the way to that word you accidentally come across some other words that are actually more interesting than the word you were looking up, and pretty soon you've spent some time exploring some words you weren't counting on. And that is sort of what has happened here in my looking at mythology and the characters in this work. I have gone down various paths. So I want to give you kind of an idea of our journey. This is our journey, the plan. And I'm being ambitious calling it a plan as usual, but here we are. We're going to start off talking a little bit about Women's History Month, which would seem to have very little to do with Circe, but it is connected. And I went there because this is March, indeed, Women's History Month. We'll look at a couple of Circe book covers beyond the one that you have with your copy. We'll talk about why the author wanted to tell the story, who is telling the story, why that's important, who is telling this particular story of Odysseus and Circe. We'll talk about some other women in Greek mythology. We'll talk about women in mythologies from around the world. And then we'll hit on the topic I know you will enjoy when we get there: women with power. Women with power. It's a frightening concept. And apparently it has been frightening people for thousands of years. So let's see where we go here. So, Women's History Month, and it should surprise no one that Women's History Month started as a single day, Women's History Day, International Women's Day, actually. It's March 8th. And that started in 1911. So there was an International Women's Day in 1911, and it was recognized by a variety of countries. But it was not until 1980 when President Carter declared that week, the week beginning March 7th, as National Women's Week. Congress passed that as a, I don't know if law is the right word, but they passed that resolution after President Carter declared it. I tried very hard to find out what the voting numbers were on that resolution. How many, whether it was unanimous or whether it was a close vote. I couldn't find any particulars about that. So those of you who are into history, especially history of Congress and voting history of Congress, if you find out what the actual vote was on that resolution to make that week National Women's Week, I would be very curious to know. And what really, I was really sort of assuming there would be some opposition to it. I was wondering what their argument was, but I didn't have much luck finding that. So maybe you can help me with that. And similarly, when March became Women's History Month, I also could not find out any particulars about how Congress voted to make that happen. How many, whether it was unanimous or whether there were opposing votes. I was just very curious about that. So I know there's some history buffs out there who might want to look that up for us or help me with that. March is also Women's History Month in the UK and in Australia, but it's in October in Canada. And the reason that it's that Women's History Month is October in Canada is because that was the month that a very important law passed to allow women to serve as senators in the Canadian government. And that was in the 1920s. So they decided to make October Women's History Month in Canada. All right, so there's Women's History Month. There was no Women's History Month in the centuries BC during the time that the stories of Odysseus and Circe were told. This, incidentally, is the cover of Circe, Madeline Miller's novel, in Korea. And I like to look at these different covers because it gives me a sense of what other countries see as striking or important. In this cover, you see the Circe, the character I assume is Circe, holding a cup. And I imagine what she is doing there is offering the drink to Odysseus that she is intending to turn him into a pig, which is what she did with his men that arrived ahead of him. She has that kind of look on her face, like she's got a plan. It's not there's something going on there. Here's another one I found very interesting. This is an Indonesian cover of the book. And I studied this for quite a while, trying to see if there, was hidden here in this foliage any human figure or face. And I couldn't find one. So I think that's interesting that on this cover, it's kind of the natural world that Circe's island was for her. That's kind of suggested here in this cover. It still is hiding many secrets. There were two covers I found for French editions, both pretty interesting ones. There's the one on the right is using a detail from a painting of Circe, and the one on the left is kind of an outline drawing, which is suggestive and interesting as well for different reasons. So these are the French covers. So why did Madeline Miller want to tell this story or retell it? Because it was a story that existed, at least in a certain way. Why did she want to tell the story? And I believe y'all had access to a conversation with Madeline Miller. She may have addressed this in her talk, but there have been a number of interviews that are available online where she talks about this, why she wanted to retell Circe's story. And I'm going to give you some of that here. All right, this is a quote that I'll share with you. In ancient mythology, nymphs were pawns or prey, married off, assaulted, raped. They had little agency over their own lives. Yet when we see Circe in the Odyssey, she is immensely powerful, capable of great destruction, and also great benevolence. She has done an end around and literally invented her own power, witchcraft. I wanted to discover how she came to the power and what it was like for her to wield it in a world that is so hostile to her independence. So in Madeline Miller's retelling of Circe, she explores how this witchcraft developed and how, as a nymph with limited power, she was able to learn and grow and become more and more powerful, totally on her own, or almost totally so. And Madeline Miller used, of course, the Odyssey, where that section, so it's it's a very long work, and the part where Odysseus visits Circe's islands is just a small piece of it, but it's a very memorable piece. So she uses that as inspiration, but she also uses several other texts and stories and parts of myths from other sources, and puts them together and does a lot of invention on her own. So this is one reason she wanted to tell that story. But this is significant too. Another quote from the author: Odysseus pulls out his sword, and Circe screams and falls to her knees and, basically begs him for mercy, and also offers to take him to her bed. And I remember this feeling of just utter disappointment. She is disappointed because the powerful Circe gives in to Odysseus so easily. And that just did not sit well with her, because Circe had developed such power and independence. And yet in this moment, gives in pretty quickly to Odysseus's weapon, not only his weapon, but his ability to defy her potion, the one that worked with Odysseus's men previous to his arrival. So that scene of surprising to Madeline Miller's weakness, that scene of weakness really disappointed her. And I think she wanted to give Circe another chance, give Circe another opportunity. Now, this is the language from the actual Odyssey. There are several translations of the Odyssey, so it is just one translation from that moment that disappointed the author so much. Without a word, I drew my sharpened sword, and in one bound held it against her throat. She cried out, then slid under to take my knees, catching her breath to say, in her distress, what champion of what country can you be? And you'll notice from this very short passage that Odysseus is the narrator. He is the storyteller. It is his character that tells what happens. And Circe does not have, she has some, like here at the end, she has things to say, but we don't really know what she's thinking or feeling. And that is also something that the author wanted to provide for us. And she says here, I was really frustrated about how sort of flattened the portrait was, and how it was really still just Odysseus's story. So that there was, Circe was just a minor character. And you didn't really understand much about her. The painting there on the right is one I found, or drawing, of Circe having turned, or is in the process of turning Odysseus's men into pigs, although these look more like boars with fangs, so that they're a little more menacing looking. But that gives you, it gives you something to play with. Men are pigs, men are boars. I'm not gonna expound on that. I'll let you do that amongst yourselves. And another quote from Madeline Miller. What I wanted to do was flip that completely and put her at the center of the story and make Odysseus the cameo. So I wanted him to occupy the same space in her life that she occupies in his, i.e., not very much, and to really focus on sort of a woman's life. So that's what she accomplishes in the novel. In Circe, she becomes the story. She allows Circe to become the storyteller, and we get Circe's full story and her motivations and her growth and challenges and her encounters with many other characters besides Odysseus only. And in this novel, Odysseus is converted to a minor character, an important character, but who just makes a brief appearance. So I think she achieved that goal, certainly. So one of the things that I wanted to address in my talk today is the importance of who is telling the story. And we see this in the shift from the Odyssey, where Circe is a minor character and does not get the opportunity to tell her own story because it's Odysseus telling the story. So we get Odysseus's point of view of everything, of his journey, and Circe's just a small piece of it. And how much changes when we read Madeline Miller's version and see the story through her eyes and through her storyteller's voice, and see finally what she is thinking, or what at least Madeline Miller imagines that she is thinking and feeling when Odysseus is present there. So it's a completely different story depending on the character that's telling it, not just the author, but the character that's telling it. So this particular story, the Odyssey, here we go, talking about that concept of who is telling the story. In the Odyssey, this is Madeline Miller again. In the Odyssey, Circe is very clearly the incarnation of male anxiety about female power. The fear is that if women have power, men are getting turned into pigs. The word witch is still used today as a slur against women with an amount of power that makes society nervous. All right, so what was really interesting to me about this quote is that it makes her novel Circe not just a retelling of a myth, but a novel that has a message beyond the ancient world. And this concept of a male anxiety about female power, I was pretty interested in exploring that. So let me see where that takes us. Now, this is a quote from Women in Myth, which is a section on the PBS website. The stories and myths associated with women tell us a lot more about the preoccupations of Greek men than they do about the opinions and imaginations of Greek women. Women were the givers of life in an age when the processes of conception, fertility, and childbirth were still deeply mysterious and little understood. As a result, many of the mythical stories about women manifest signs of a deep male anxiety about feminine power. So this passage from PBS backs up what Madeline Miller was suggesting, that that original mythology presented a concern of men, an anxiety that men had about the power of women. And so here, when the passage refers to women having life powers, the givers of life in an age where processes of conception, fertility, and childbirth were still mysterious, women have that life power that makes them unique and powerful in a way that men certainly are not. And the suggestion here is that in ancient Greece, in the time when these myths were supposedly happening, or when they were created, where they were told and spread and ultimately written, men were the storytellers, and men put those women and the women characters in a position of either weakness or in some cases evil. So we're going to talk some more about that, but I think that's interesting. So now we're going to talk a little bit about who tells the actual story of Odysseus in the myth that occurs in the Odyssey, the epic poem that has that story of Odysseus meeting Circe, which Madeline Miller retells in her novel some centuries and centuries later. So here's our author, Homer. And, Homer was an interesting guy because everything that is known about him is supposed or guessed about or imagined. No one knows anything really about him. And they don't even know if he is the actual author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. There are, and have been for multiple centuries, guesses and theories about the authors of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we're focusing on the Odyssey today, but both the Iliad and the Odyssey are very long epic poems that not only are based on mythology, it is, they are the source material for much of the information that we have in Greek mythology. Much of it comes from these two epic poems. There are other sources too, but a lot of it comes from the Iliad and the Odyssey. But these were not originally written down. No, they were memorized and performed, not necessarily in their entirety. I mean, that would take quite a while. But in the ancient world, there were individuals who did this professionally. They would perform or recite sections of the Iliad or the Odyssey or the myths that are contained in them, the stories that are contained in them, at festivals, at gatherings, and they were never originally written down. That happened much, much later. So how is it that we seem to credit a single person with their authorship? Well, there are scholars that see so much similarity in the two stories, the two epic poems, both in the writing or the style of the language, the descriptions, the way characters are in both works, what the characters are like, that they feel that it had to be created by a single author. But there are other scholars that believe that Homer is not really one person, but a group of people, storytellers who over time ended up with these two epic stories and very many similarities just through the act of telling and retelling. So we just don't know about Homer, but I am here to tell you. I am here to tell you that I have a new theory, and I'm sharing it with you first, about the authorship of the Odyssey and the Iliad. And this is a big moment now. It came to me late one night. It seemed so obvious to me. And I'm just happy to share it with you now. my theory for the actual authorship of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer, of course, of course. It all makes sense now, doesn't it? And you know, all of those ideas about you know, a masculine voice telling these stories, and that anxiety over the power of women, it all fits in here. It's all right here. So I know you'll be hearing more about this, about Homer Simpson being the actual author of these epic poems. Just remember that you heard it here first. All right, so let's talk about a few other women in Greek mythology. Now, I wanted to explore the idea of women, the anxiety that men felt about women in power, and see how that comes across in other stories in Greek mythology. So let's go. All right, Pandora. Pandora, and I suspect most of you, and if you are not into mythology and have not read Edith Hamilton's book or any of the other books of mythology, you probably are familiar with Pandora, who opened the box that unleashed on the world all of these ills and evils. Pandora was, at least in one set of mythologies, and there are different versions of these stories, but in one version, Zeus, who was sort of, you know, there are many gods and goddesses. Zeus is the leader. Zeus created Pandora. She was the very first woman, the first mortal woman. There were goddesses. She was the first mortal woman. And he did this as a punishment for men. So the first woman, according to this myth, Pandora was created as a punishment for men. Zeus was angry at mortal men who at that point existed in the world all on their own. Things were going great. They had, you know, they were not causing trouble. Everything was going smooth for them. But Prometheus provided them fire. They got a little cocky, and Zeus felt they were being disrespectful. And so to punish them, to punish men, he created Pandora, or actually, I think he had Hephaestus create Pandora. Hephaestus was the Vulcan character, the god that created things. Zeus contracted it out, essentially, and had her created as a punishment. And this quote from Edith Hamilton: "From her, the first woman, comes the race of women who are an evil to man, with a nature to do evil." So Pandora is a problem. She is created to be a problem, although the main problem she causes stems from her curiosity. And I really liked this artistic representation of Pandora and all the evils coming out that look like you know, insects and reptiles. Another scholar writes, the original myth of Pandora was the tale of the fall from innocence, the hardships of mortal existence, and the fear of women. So again, with this story, we get that sense that through the story, women are made to be at fault for some of the world's problems. But remember, it's men telling the story. Okay, the story of the Trojan War. Now, this one was especially interesting to me, and it is, in fact, the Iliad, Homer's The Iliad takes place just in one portion of the Trojan War. But this is the mythology behind the Trojan War, how the Trojan War got started. And the painting that you see there is an artist's rendition of what Helen of Troy might have looked like. So we begin with a goddess named Eris, who was the goddess of strife. She was a troublemaker. And at the events, the parties, the get-togethers that the gods and goddesses had, she often was not invited because she was the goddess of strife. I mean, why would you invite the goddess of strife? Really. So to get even, or to cause some strife, is what she did. Eris had a golden apple that was labeled "for the fairest," and tossed it into this group of gods and goddesses, this party. So it didn't say who the fairest was. So the goddesses started arguing about who it should belong to. And again, you see, even though these are goddesses and not mortal women, they often are creating problems. Now the gods certainly did too. So it's interesting, that dichotomy. And I think you find in mythology that the goddesses, Athena, Hera, for example, often use their intelligence, their cunning, their trickery to get what they want, because the male gods have the power. They have the power, the physical strength, the ability to win with that power and strength, but they can be fooled. So the women often have the superior intelligence to get what they want in different ways. So there are three contenders for this golden apple. Hera is one, Athena is one, and Aphrodite is the other. And it is decided that a mortal man whose name is Paris, he's a prince, he is known to be kind of a playboy, and it's suggested that he would know which of the three goddesses was the fairest. So he's the judge, and it is not a good position to be in. I mean, there is no good way out of that choice. And the three goddesses who want to be the fairest, they don't trust him to make the choice based on who is truly most beautiful. So they all bribe him. Each one comes up with a bribe. One offers him to be the leader of all of Europe and Asia. That's pretty big. One offers him to be victorious in battle. That's important. That's good. The third one, Aphrodite, offers him the most beautiful woman in the world to be his. So, well, there you go. That's what he picks. Aphrodite's choice, the most beautiful woman in the world, who, I don't know if this is just kind of generally acknowledged, is Helen. Unfortunately, Helen is already married. She's married to a Greek king, Menelaus. And so taking Helen away from him to give to Paris ultimately causes the Trojan War. And we see, and it's trouble with in-laws on both sides, right? That leads to the Trojan War. And so Helen is often depicted as being very vain, even though we don't see that in this painting. Many paintings of her show her looking at herself in a mirror. She's very selfish. That's often the depiction. So a war that lasted 10 years begins with her, but really begins with this issue between the gods and goddesses. I have another really interesting painting of Helen of Troy. Look at that. You know, she's pouting. You don't really see that kind of expression with the goddesses. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, we're going to move forward in time a little bit. By the 5th century BC, attitudes toward female power had become rather less damning. And in some of the plays of the era, women play generally positive roles. A prime example is Sophocles' tragedy Antigone. This is from PBS, this quote. So 5th century BC is when some of the great plays were written, ancient Greek plays, including Sophocles' plays. Antigone is one of those. And Antigone is a heroine in that play, which is unusual. She is not only the main character, but she is a tragic hero in this play. So we see a shift in attitude about women in power. You know, she's not portrayed as an evil, although some of the other characters see that is, or they say that. But the play's attitude about her is that she is a woman of strength and honor. In the play, one of her brothers has died in battle and is declared a traitor, and his body is left out unburied because he was considered a traitor. And she is not willing to obey that law. So she breaks the law to show honor to her brother, her dead brother, and to bury him, or to symbolically bury him, even though she knows the consequences of breaking the law. So the fact that she is a tragic hero in this play shows a change, shows a shift. And I think I have a little aside here. This is an aside, but I just had to share it with you. There is a contemporary play called The Island. It was written by Ethel Fugard and two men who were at one time prisoners, political prisoners in South Africa, much like Mandela had been for much of his life. And in this play, the prisoners, who are all men in this prison, all men, perform for their own entertainment and the entertainment of other prisoners. They perform Antigone. And as a result of that, going through the story of Antigone, there are comparisons with their own political choices that had costs, great costs. And there's a great deal of humor in it too, as you see in the photograph. One of the prisoners has to play the part of Antigone, and so is wearing part of a mop. If you get an opportunity to see this play, please see it. It's really something, and shows how the ancient stories can still apply to more current events. Here's another one that's really interesting. Lysistrata. This is a comedy written also roughly the same time period as Antigone. In this play, the women of both opposing countries. At the time, there was a war going on. They are opposed to the war because it disrupts their lives. The men, their husbands, their brothers, fathers are involved in this war, are killed in the war, and they're ready for the war to stop. So it is a comedy in which the women come together, unify, and protest the war. And the comedy in it comes from the fact that their strategy is to go on a sex strike. The women all agree to withhold sex from their men until the men agree to stop fighting. And it is very effective. It is a very effective strategy. So Lysistrata, if you get an opportunity, it's not performed as, I mean, occasionally you'll see it performed, but if you can find it to read it, is very entertaining. But it shows, women taking charge. So a few examples of women in mythologies around the world. And one of the things I found, as in this example from Norse mythology, is that women were often the source of problems. Again, we have that issue of when men are telling the story, there's a point of view there. Hel is one goddess in Norse mythology who rules over hell. I mean, that's her job. So she is presented as greedy, harsh, and cruel, or at least indifferent to the concerns of the living and the dead. Celtic mythology, there's a woman goddess, I don't know if that's the right word exactly, called the Morrigan. And she is associated with war and fate, especially foretelling doom, death, and sometimes victory in battle, and is often portrayed as a crow, the Morrigan. Mamiwata, an African spirit in many African mythologies, not a single country. It seems she is a figure that is found in multiple cultures. Known often for being both good and evil together, helpful and hurtful simultaneously. So, which I know is a challenge. Finnish mythology. And here we have Leviatar, the daughter of the god of death, who is impregnated by the wind and gives birth to 9 diseases. So, I mean, there's kind of an element there of Pandora in a way. So many of the women figures in other mythologies, even though we're not going into, at least today, into the stories in those mythologies, but many of the women or women figures are sources of trouble. So I started thinking about this, the idea that many of these ancient stories, the ancient myths, feature women with power as trouble, but the stories were told by men. In the example of Odysseus and the Odyssey told by Homer, created by Homer, and the character Odysseus being the actual narrator, the actual storyteller. It's his story that he tells. That idea that women who have power make men anxious, as being part of these ancient stories, but it's not true anymore, right? I mean, we don't see that today, right? Well, I don't know. Let's look. I started, this is this is not fiction even. I started looking at the 19th Amendment, the amendment that gave women the right to vote. So this, was passed in 1920. I think most of us know that. And the fact that it took so long for women to be given the right to vote, since it was in the hands of men to make that decision, why didn't they make the decision? Why did they wait so long? Women, the power of women, the power to vote. My gosh, what happened? So I think there's some connection here. But anyway, I found out some interesting things about the 19th Amendment that I'm going to share briefly with you. One, the very first state to ratify the 19th Amendment was Wisconsin. That was in June of 1919. And 36 states had to ratify it in order for it to become law, become an amendment. So 36 states had to ratify it, and it took some time. The 36th state, the one that pushed it on to victory, was Tennessee, and that happened in August of 1920. So I know you're wondering, what about Georgia? Where was Georgia in there? When did Georgia ratify the 19th Amendment? Well, that's an interesting story. Georgia, in July of 1919, became the first state to reject the 19th Amendment. Georgia was the first state to reject it, to vote against giving women the right to vote. And a few states rejected it, but the majority, the 36, which I think had to be like a 3/4 majority, ratified it. So it became a law in 1920. But Georgia voted against it and was the very first state to vote against it. They didn't want to waste any time. It's about a month after Wisconsin was the first state to ratify it. But it gets better. So that was a election year, 1920, a presidential election year. And in August of 1920, that amendment was ratified, so women could vote in the election, the presidential election in 1920, that November, right? Well, not in Georgia, because state lawmakers refused to waive a requirement that all voters be registered 6 months before election in order to vote. So they used that requirement to forbid women in Georgia from voting for president that year. They had to wait. I mean, they were able to vote after that, but there's more. So Georgia finally ratified the 19th Amendment. Many of the states that had not yet ratified it when it got to 36 went ahead and ratified it in the years after that, just to show support, solidarity. Georgia did not ratify the 19th Amendment until 1970, 50 years later. And at that time, there were only three other states that had not ratified it. I'll let y'all guess amongst yourselves who those three states were. One of them surprised me for sure. All right, so there's some evidence. I mean, this is 100 years ago now, but some evidence, and I suspect that you could find additional examples of that same issue, men being concerned about what will happen if women get power. So that novel, Circe, has that relevance, even though it is based on an ancient myth and is retelling ancient stories. That's why that novel resonates so much now. And I'm just showing again a couple of these quotes about that. The stories and myths associated with women tell us a lot more about the preoccupations of Greek men than they do about the opinions and imaginations of Greek women. And I wonder if we couldn't look at other stories that are being told, not only ancient ones, but current ones, and see how different they might be, if depending on who's telling the story. If it's a man telling the story versus a woman telling the story. And then that one quote again of Madeline Miller's from an interview, the idea that men fear women having power because they might get turned into pigs. Maybe metaphorically, anyway. So, and the novel, Circe, a novel that has retold an ancient story and made it, in many ways, fresh and new, with a lot for us to talk about today. And that is the end of my presentation, and I appreciate so much you're bearing with me for that. Let's see, I have a little, I'm going to stop the share right here. All right, so we have a question from Heather. In the Odyssey, isn't Odysseus still portrayed as a flawed character? Maybe not as much in Circe, but seems strange that we would still admire him. Yes, he is actually in the Odyssey. He's not perfect. He is not a perfect character. He's not a character that has no flaws and is in fact, he doesn't really fit what you would expect to be a heroic character. He is physically, he's portrayed as maybe being physically strong, but not being really in shape. He is a man that would just prefer not to be at war. You know, he's been in the Trojan War with the more traditional heroes like Achilles and Agamemnon, but it was not something he wanted. And his whole journey in the Odyssey is to get home to his wife and child that he's been separated from for 10 years. So, you know, he has a noble mission. He's not, at least on the surface, a bad guy. So I don't want to suggest that is true, but yes, he's definitely a flawed character. I think what Madeline Miller was interested in was not so much that he was an aggravating character in the sense of being a perfect hero. It was just that it was his story only, and then she felt that Circe, as an example, deserved her own story as well. Oh, the three states that did not ratify the 19th Amendment until after Georgia did. The three states were Louisiana, Mississippi, and North Carolina. I was a little surprised at North Carolina. Um, Being from Alabama myself, I was expecting Alabama to be one of those three, but actually Alabama ratified it. They were not one of the first 36, but they went ahead and ratified it. I think in I want to say the 1950s. So some years after, but not 50 years after. So I don't know what that says about Georgia. I'm going to leave that to y'all. Um, but as with most things, a lot of what we believe depends on who is telling the story, or a lot of what we know. So, all right, Heather, I'm going to turn this over to you if you want to conclude for us, but I appreciate everybody who's watching, whether you're watching here live with us now or at some future time.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, everybody that's tuned in or will tune in later. We appreciate it. And as always, we appreciate your time and expertise, John. And I guess that's it. Awesome.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
We'll see you later. As we all do on Zoom, we will wave goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.